Hey, Dave, thank you so much for joining us today on the 4040 Vision podcast to talk about the legendary life and complicated life of Jim Brown. So, I want to jump right in and I want to start with perhaps the easier side of things to talk about, and that's his exploits as an athlete. So, I've recently heard you compare Jim Brown to Paul Bunyan, and I've heard you say that he's the greatest American athlete in the 20th century. So, what is it about him that makes you say that, and what was it about him that made him such a special
Thanks so
athlete?
much for having me, Khaled. First and foremost, I should preface what I say with the fact that Jim Brown did not think he was the best athlete of the 20th century. When I spoke to him about this, he thought without question it was the great Olympian football and baseball player, Jim Thorpe. When I said, well, Mr. Brown, I think you're the best team sport athlete in history, he again looked at me like he was suffering a fool. And he said, no, it's Bill Russell. Of course, Bill Russell was one of Jim Brown's closest friends, so maybe a little bit of bias there. But his reasoning was interesting. He said, look, 11 championships. That's the whole point of team sports. And that's what he accomplished, and no one else has. So therefore, Bill Russell's the best. Now, I think Jim Brown was the greatest team sport athlete or even athlete of the 20th century, precisely because he was able to excel in so many different arenas who oftentimes there's not a lot of great crossover between sports. Like my son is a quarterback and he tried out for baseball this year, and let me just tell you, the skills did not immediately translate the football to baseball skills. So that's just a reality of team sports. And yet in Jim Brown, we have somebody, and frankly, the only person who is in the conversation as the greatest ever in two different team sports. And I'm, of course, talking about football and what was Jim Brown's favorite sport to play, lacrosse. But it's
Mhm.
not just about football and lacrosse, the exploits of which are well known. It's also it's also not just about Jim Brown being 6'2", 6'3", 240, who could run a sub 4.5. And when I say a sub 4.5, also, we got to remember this is an era where cleats were made of like steel and they're running on dirt.
Yeah.
So all of these times you hear from back then, it's always like, because everything we have now is if not chemically, at least from an equipment perspective, these are enhanced times that we live in the 21st century. So I mentioned lacrosse and football, but let's also talk about other sports for a second. Like he scored, I think he definitely scored over 50 points in a high school basketball game, and it was said he scored over 50 points in a Syracuse game too. He definitely quit playing basketball at Syracuse because they had a quota of the number of black athletes they would allow on the team at any given
Mhm.
time. And that for him was utterly unacceptable because it meant, and this is a common theme in Jim Brown's life, that they were treating him like a boy and not a man. And he would not accept anything other than being treated like a full blown man, not human being, but man. And that's an important distinction that we can talk about if you like. But let's talk about other things for a
Yeah, of
second.
course.
Like Jim Brown was asked to compete in an NCAA decathlon event. He had never practiced the decathlon individual events. He came in fifth. He was asked to train for the 1956 Olympics. He was asked to try out for the Yankees in a personal letter from their manager, Casey Stengel. The man did not play baseball. He was asked if he would sign a contract to fight for the heavyweight championship of the world. Of course, boxing in that department. I found one article in doing my very, very, very deep dive research on Jim Brown. I found one article that talked about him sort of, meandering onto a cricket field and being the best cricket player. I mean, so you're talking about somebody who, if you put Jim Brown in sports in the same arena, he was the best. He was the baddest MF. And to me, the fact that he was able to excel in all these different arenas and is in the conversation as a best ever in two different sports is what makes him, at the very least, in the conversation as the greatest athlete in the history, at the very least, of the United States.
Yeah, you can definitely put him on that Mount Rushmore. I think of him, Jim Thorpe, Bo Jackson, maybe throw Deion Sanders in there as guys that were able to excel
And the
at
most
least 2
impressive, oh,
sports.
I'm so sorry,
So
but I
what
have
was
to say that the most impressive number related to Jim Brown Just like to me, the most impressive number with regards to Serena Williams, for example, is 27. That's how many years she played in pro tournaments. Like, holy crap, 14 to 41. Um, for Jim Brown, the most impressive number is zero. That's how many games he missed in the NFL. Zero. And this was at a time where he was a part of 60% of the Cleveland Brown offensive plays. And this was also a time in the NFL where what went on at the bottom of tackle piles, I mean, wouldn't have been out of place in a Turkish prison. I mean, people stomping your ankles, stomping your nuts, stomping your wrists. And Jim Brown's technique, and I spoke to him about this in the face of that, was he said he made sure no matter what had happened, he got up very slowly as if he was hurt. So nobody would know if he was hurt or not. And that would frustrate defenders to no end.
There's some definite brilliance there. So, what was it about football that made him choose that as his career path over, lacrosse or being a decathlete or any of these other exploits that
Well,
he was interested
certainly
in?
you have to start with, no real career prospects in any of those other sports. While football held the chance for fame, money. I mean, he was somebody who was raised in another family's home. His mother, Teresa Brown, was a domestic worker in Great Neck, New York, and they lived in the home where that she cleaned. So, this is not someone who came from wealth in any sense of the word, although he went to an affluent high school because of where his mom was a domestic worker, which is an interesting to me. And that's how he got people sometimes ask, like, how did this man, a black man in mid-century America, become this great lacrosse player? Well, it was from growing up in Long Island, which is a huge lacrosse.
Yeah, because lacrosse is a very
Yeah.
elite sport, right?
And in fact, that's at the high school he went to. That's the memory of him that's there is a signed lacrosse ball. But Jim Brown in high school also averaged 15 yards a carry rushing over the last 2 years that he was there. So why did he choose football? I mean, he chose football largely because he had a high school coach named Ed Walsh, who was really, in many respects, one of two father figures that Jim Brown had. Two white men of great standing in the Great Neck, Long Island, Manhasset community. And one of them, a man named Judge Kenneth Malloy. Judge Malloy went to Syracuse, and that's a whole story in and of itself. Excuse me, in how it was facilitated that he went to Syracuse, becoming the second black player to ever play for their football team. But it really was his football coach, Ed Walsh, in high school, who was only 145 pounds, who was a very different kind of coach than you might imagine a mid-50s football coach, like much more of a nurturing presence than the sort of like, this is the army, kind of thing. So that, I think, is what attracted him to football is, the prospects of wealth, the prospects of getting out, the prospects of fame, also the prospects of doing something that he excelled at, which was expressing physical violence and fury through sports. He was distilled fury. And, even if that didn't match, friends of his have hated that description because they said that's not who he was, like some raving, angry person. And, some people have said, well, I've seen other instances that actually show that he could at times be completely captured by anger.
Sure,
But
sure.
and I certainly have stories in my book, like firsthand accounts of, when he had to deal with like a racist on the golf course, a racist waiter in a restaurant, a racist person pushing him too hard for an autograph, or even a non-racist person pushing him too hard for an autograph, or situations when dealing with the women in his life where that fury would come to the surface and that anger would come to the surface. But when it came to how he would operate in the locker room, man, they described him as his friends anyway, as a very cool customer. And there's a lot of evidence of that as well. Like many of us, he could be different people at different times. And